Are you ever frustrated that your drawings just don't look real enough, that they end up with a bit of a cartoony look that is not something you want them to have? And the problem is not just drawing accurate shapes, which so often is the focus that we feel we need to have for our drawings to look real, that the objects have to have the, well, actual shape accurately, proportion-wise and scale-wise, of our subject. It's a lot more than that if we want to have our drawings look as though they're real things, real scenes. And the key to working through this problem is to spend some time considering what makes real life look like real life. What is it about what we see and how we see it that defines reality in a visual sense? Because the answers to this question are going to give us the clues, give us the directions to what we need to focus on when we draw. For each of these points, I'm going to first just outline in a few sentences what the point is, and then show you how it may look in some drawings I've done. And the first thing, as I mentioned earlier, if we want our drawings to look real, is to capture accuracy of the shapes, because nothing says this is not real as loudly and as clearly as our drawings objects not looking the way they look in real life. If the proportions aren't correct, if the scale of one object to another isn't correct, and if the perspective isn't correct, then even if we don't know enough to understand exactly why the buildings, the objects don't look quite right, most of us have enough sense of how the world looks in reality to know that something is wrong. Cartoons, particularly children's cartoons, often have deliberate distortion of real shapes, real forms, real perspective, either for simplification or just for stylistic purposes. Either way, it's not something we want in our drawings. I'm not just talking of the obvious perspective errors where things look like this instead of like this, but ones perhaps that aren't as obvious, where certainly for anyone who has some understanding or observation of buildings, particularly in perspective, there is something unsettling about this one compared to this one. As well as these angles, it's also to do with the way perspective affects elements horizontally, the narrowing as they move further away, and understanding how this applies not just to windows and walls and columns, but on the ground as well. Why this pathway is very unnatural looking and why this pathway feels as if it's more real, because one of the differences is that the perspective is accurately applied, and includes things such as how people and crowds of people work in with perspective theory. If we understand how this all works, it's a lot easier to produce a drawing where there's no awkwardness with the perspective that makes it look less real. The second thing we need to work at capturing in our drawings is a sense of distance. The sense of some things being closer than others and some things perhaps being very, very far away is very much part of our perception of reality, part of the world as we look around it. And so I really want to get that feeling that some things are very close, some things are not as close, and some things are very far away in what I draw. Now, I'm drawing on a sheet of paper, which is a flat two-dimensional object. So everything I draw on that sheet of paper is going to be the same distance from me when I look at it. Nothing is going to be, in reality, further back. So I have to try and create the effect in my drawing of some things being closer and some things being further back. And to do that, I've got to work out what's the difference between things I see close up and things that are further away in life. And then in the way I draw my objects, I need to incorporate as many of those differences in close-looking things as opposed to further away looking things as I possibly can with whatever I'm using to create my drawing. For me, most of the time, that's ink. Besides the fact that things get smaller as they get further away, the three things that I think is important to remember are that, first, clarity gets less as things get further away. We're looking through more atmosphere as we look at things further away, as well as the fact that they're smaller, and that changes our ability to see all the detail further away that we would see close up. The effect of looking through more atmosphere as things move further away means that colours are not as bright, but also the values become lighter as things move further away. The same object with the same light from the same direction, the same general colour, will be darker if it's closer than if it's further away. So when I draw, I need to draw in a way that captures these visual differences between things that I'm looking at that are close up to me and further away if I want to create the effect of distance in my drawing. I drew this view of Trafalgar Square to exaggerate some of the stylistic approach we can use to emphasize distance, to have a strong and immediate sense that these things, this part is closer to us even than this part, than these parts, that this part is still closer than these parts, that these people, that this lamp is closer than what's behind, and that all of this is closer than the things that sit further and furthest back. Heavier lines to capture the sense of clarity with things closer, that things are easier to see, that edges are more obvious, that there's more detail we can see, and so forth. But it's not just street scenes. Even in an interior scene, we want to be able to create the feel of some objects being closer, not just because they're drawn larger and they're at the front of the scene, but because they feel closer because of how we've drawn them. And some parts then are further back and some parts are much further back. The closest things feel, then the further away, the furthest things are going to seem. It's not just architecture, but in nature as well. We need to firstly perceive and secondly to draw, use marks that create the effect of distance, the effect of closer clumps of grass on the ground and leaf litter moving backwards further into the landscape through whatever subject matter we have. In this case, we have these stairs to lead us further back, but also even without these stairs, we get the sense of this foliage being much further back than this foliage, and that this foliage here is further back than this, but not as far as this. And sometimes it's as simple as being planned in our strategizing and drawing our elements in the right order so that we can help give the idea of some things being closer to us than other things more effectively, because we didn't draw a line first too quickly that would prevent us capturing the effect of distance that we actually want. There's more to capturing a sense of distance, of closest and furthest, than merely getting the perspective correct. All of these things add together to create a sense, a feeling, the effect of how things look in real life. This next point is, if I want to create a sense of reality in my drawing, I need to capture the three-dimensional form of reality. Again, my drawing is going to be 2 dimensions. It's going to be on a flat sheet of paper. So I will be drawing shapes on the paper, but I want to create the illusion, the feeling of 3 dimensions, of not just a height and a width, but of depth as well. And the obvious way to do this is to make sure I include all the depth lines as much as possible. And depth lines are, as they say, the lines that indicate that one plane is set back from another plane by a small or a large degree. Now, if it's set back by a large degree, that's not such a problem. But even when planes are set back by very slight degrees, think of a wall with an inset window, but then in that inset window there's some beading that is inset again, and maybe a second piece of wooden beading inset, and then the glass. All of these materials and moving back from one plane to the next actually gives me a strip which I need to incorporate in my drawing, at least to some degree, because that's part of form. That's part of 3 dimensions. The other way we can indicate form in our drawing is the way we put any marks on that shape, on that object, on the form we're wanting to create, to make it easier for someone looking at our drawing to perceive the 3-dimensional form. This overlaps really, though, with a number of points that we'll get to shortly. Here we see some depth lines in an architectural detail. We see that on this corner we step back maybe just a centimetre or so. We see there's a window surround that sits forward by a similar amount, and then we step back into the window frame. But within the window frame we see there's some wooden beading where we step back again, and we do that with all of the beading top along the sides and this cross piece. We see with these cornices, these overhanging cornices, we have depth lines where we sit back as we come down. In this case we curve back, we sit back, and here we have another thin setback. The same thing happens with this dormer window as well. With this guttering downpipe, this bracket has depth going horizontally backwards, that because we're looking up at it, we can see the underneath depth of the bracket. Usually, if we're drawing buildings, we're a bit further away from the building for these depth lines, but it's still important, as much as is practicable, that we put them in, that for the side where we see the depth, that we add that extra line so that we don't draw windows that look like they've been drawn on the outside wall with a texture. The same principle we use here, though, works here, and it also works on a much larger scale of architectural drawing, where even though the depth lines are very close often to, if you like, the surface lines, they're important for creating an overall impression of 3 dimensions, of architectural elements that sit forward ahead of others or that move back, recessed into others. And it's not just architecture, of course. 3-dimensional form, such as this tree, is not created by outlining shapes. It's created by putting lines and marks for whatever reason we can justify onto our subject to indicate the 3-dimensional form. And using hatching in shadows is a really valuable way of doing this. Compare the difference between these trees and these trees, where we've used our hatch lines as a way of emphasizing the underlying form of the trees, compared to these ones, where we've only used the hatching, the cross hatching, to create value, darkness, and we haven't had any regard for the underlying form, the 3-dimensionality of these tree canopies. Particularly when we draw from a photo, though, and particularly when we're drawing nature from a photo, the sense of 3 dimensions is often minimized by the flat capture of the camera. Often it's not very obvious from the photo that some parts of the canopy are much closer to us than others. That in fact, often the extremity or the silhouette of the tree that we can see is significantly further away than the closest parts. It's easy to think of it as a flat 2-dimensional surface because that's how it looks in the photo. So it's important when we draw from a photo, if we want a sense of reality in our drawings, to firstly see, to rediscover the 3 dimensions that may have been minimized in a visual sense by the photographic process. The next way to create a sense of reality is to capture, well, the word that seems to be used most is texture, to capture the textures of reality. So if we look at this scene behind me, the grass, the ground has a certain texture. It's not a smooth, flat plane, which is a certain texture in itself. And while the ground may not be an important part of why I'm drawing this scene, capturing the sense of the shaggy grass all over it, desperately in need of a mow, would be part of capturing the feeling of reality. And yet these areas can be particularly challenging when we draw, because often these areas are made up of a lot of detail, of a lot of smaller things They're in fact so small and so many of them and so concentrated together, we tend to see them as one object most of the time. But to draw as one object would be an oversimplification for our drawing. But equally, to draw all the detail is impossible to do. And even if we could, it also wouldn't really look real because we don't see all the individual details. What we need to learn to do is to draw the overall effect of the detail. I have a whole playlist on this if you're interested, showing how this works, with everything from grass to leaves to crowds of people to bricks on a wall to gravel. An incredibly important and helpful skill to understand and to learn to develop marks to capture effectively if we want our drawings to look real. What tends to happen if we don't work this out in an adequate way is that instead of putting marks that adequately capture the texture, the feel, the general surface that we're looking at, we tend to draw patterns on those surfaces that in our mind in some way relate to what that object is. But very often these patterns come from cartoons that we've seen in the past, but even if not, they end up looking very cartoon-like. This is how it can look when we settle on patterns to represent details, represent textures, that while recognizable for the actual surfaces that they represent, don't really capture the feel, the visual reality of those surfaces in an adequate way. And very often even the patterns aren't applied to the surfaces to reflect the underlying perspective. The effect can be overwhelming and distracting, where all we see are the patterns and we don't really get a sense of the three-dimensional form and the larger structures themselves. However, when we find lines and marks to capture the effect of all this detail, even when there are many lines and marks applied and a lot of detail put on, the underlying structures still stand out ahead of everything else. It doesn't matter whether we have a fairly heavy lined approach to drawing or whether we draw with a lighter touch. The same principles apply of creating the feel of the surfaces and the textures of the surface that are created by the materials that comprise the surface. And we want the marks that we use for the textures of the landscape around, whether it's the leaves or the grass or this tree stump in the front, to be very different. And it's exactly the same principle when we're faced with a lot of architectural detail, where there are so many small bits of architecture that they're like leaves on a tree. We can't possibly draw them all. What we need to do is to find marks that capture the feel, that capture the effect of the decorative elements without us having to draw that detail. It's also important where we have a lot of foliage to find marks of creating the texture so that different plants, different bushes, different shrubs, different trees can be recognized as different species. Generic foliage will never capture a sense of reality. The next important thing we need to try and capture if we want to draw with a sense of reality are the edges of what we're drawing. Edges are a really important part of how we perceive reality, particularly silhouette edges, because our brain tends to grab onto those quickly as an easy way to understand what it's looking at, to find visual clues that will enable it to identify quickly what it is. Now, of course, when we draw shapes, when we draw forms, when we draw objects, most of the time we're thinking about lines that go around the outside of an object. But the question is this an adequate way to capture reality, a sense of reality, as opposed to the accuracy of the shape? With these small tree trunks behind me, I might draw them with a line, which creates a certain effect, 2 lines in fact, that defines the shape. But in reality, I don't see a line on each side. I see a value, a darkness that stops at a certain point, and I can see very clearly where it stops because there's a much lighter value behind it with the grass. It's not that there's a line in reality, it's that the value changes, and that's really how I perceive what I'm looking at there. clarity of our perception of edges often depends on the values of the various objects. If I have a whole lot of trees and one of them is a much darker green in its leaf colour than the others, that form will stand out a lot more. If all the greens are pretty much the same, it may be hard to tell the edge of one tree from another. But even when we draw a line to represent a form where a line looks like it's going to work, often in reality it's an, well, inadequate mark to use to capture the feel of the object. It's often an oversimplification. If I'm drawing the corner of a building, I may just do a straight line because that's approximately the edge of the corner of the building. But if I can see it clearly enough, there's a brick, there's a bit of mortar, there's a brick, there's a bit of mortar, there's a brick, there's a bit of mortar, and that's actually going to have an effect to how I see the edge. Now, if it's been heavily painted and the paint is peeling off in thick chunks here and there, then that's also going to affect the way the edge looks. And if I want to capture the reality of this old, run-down, falling into disrepair building, then I need to capture something of the marks of the effect of the peeling paintwork. I want to capture something of the feel that this is made of bricks and this isn't a steel girder at the corner creating a smooth, straight edge. We so often oversimplify our edges in a way that, again, makes them look cartoon-like, because cartoons do have simplified outlines that are established with basically a continuous black line. Here we can see the difference in drawing a subject with the same degree of accuracy in shape and form and perspective, but with little regard for the edges, drawing them all the same way with a continuous, relatively heavy line, and where we pay more attention to exactly what we're drawing and we manipulate the lines and the other marks we use for those edges in a way to create a more realistic feeling, to capture the various visual elements that we see in life. With this house, notice I resisted the urge to do a nice straight defining line down here and along here and here, because I wanted to capture the fact that this old sandstone rough blocked building was made of irregular shapes that didn't create an absolutely smooth surface, that therefore catch the light in different ways and highlight different stones, but also create a jagged, if you like, effect, particularly down the corners. A straight line would have robbed the building of some of the effect of how it looks. We need to particularly be careful with edges when it comes to trees and foliage. It's so easy to do a heavy outline to define a tree canopy, which very, very seldom actually reflects what we see. We need to choose marks that reflect the leaves, the way the leaves hang on that tree, for the distance that we're seeing the tree from. And while I have this drawing in front of me, I'll just point out these cobblestones, a good example of capturing the effect of the detail, of capturing the texture by drawing something of the texture but not the detail of it. Enough in a way that shows us what's happening, but over most of the area suggesting then what we've drawn in more detail in just one part. The brain sees this and it understands that all of this is this, because what other marks we've done relate enough to this, if you like, anchor point for our understanding of the roadway. With stone, weathered stone, again, edge is important. It's not just that we want to avoid doing a heavy line along this broken edge because it's a rounded, weathered surface, but I also haven't drawn a heavy line around this silhouette edge because it also is a rounded surface that visually creates a less emphasized edge. Sometimes our edges aren't defined by lines, but by dark values behind them. Whether it's an architectural subject or whether it's one tree against another tree, sometimes our edges are defined by the darknesses, the dark values of things behind them. Again, no heavy outline, but a combination of marks to create the visual effect that I think ends up being far more realistic to look at. The same thing happening here with this hedge and the top of the hedge particularly, which is catching the sun directly, than if we outlined all the trees as our starting point. Again here, I've avoided defining these steps with straight lines or with continuous lines, but I've really created, if you like, the line by hatching that stops at slightly different places as it moves along, which gives the effect of a curved surface, even though, of course, it's still a flat sheet of paper. The same with these rounded rocks. And in this thatched cottage, imagine the difference if I'd started by drawing the outline of the roof in a heavy continuous line, rather than these light and broken lines and dots to reflect the thatching, the bundled reeds that actually construct this roof. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. If you're dissatisfied with the way your drawings look and you're wanting them to look a little bit more real life-ish, I hope these pointers can give you something to work on. But hey, in the end, however you're drawing, however it turns out, whatever you're wanting it to turn out like, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.